I'll just open up the waiting room. All right, well, officially, bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue. Welcome online and in person to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, Finding Inspiration Internationally Through EDI Practices by Granting Agencies. Thank you, panelists and audience members alike, for joining us for the launch of this report, the English launch, as I've been told. Just to situate you, fourth space is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who are the caretakers for the lands and the waters that we are meeting on, for their teachings about the earth and our relations. If you are new to Fourth Space and wondering about this operation, essentially what we do here is collaborate with our university community members and their partners to mobilize and exchange knowledge by co-creating and producing daily events, activities that are free and open to the public on a daily basis. And we do this in a hybrid manner, meaning that we are currently streaming to YouTube live. We have in-person participants here in the space as well as Zoom attendees. And what I'll note for you is that we will have a chance to take your questions and comments. So for those of you on Zoom, we'll invite you to raise a hand and we'll call on you so that you could kind of speak with your comments or reflections. Otherwise, the chat space is open for you and we'll be able to read out your comments there. And if you're joining us in person, let us know that you'll like to speak by raising your actual hand and we'll get a microphone to you so that the folks on Zoom can hear you. Thanks so much, everyone. So it's now my pleasure to pass the floor to our collaborator for this event, who's involved with the EDI Lab here at Concordia as its director. Tanya Tajmel, over to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Anna, so much for hosting us. Hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Tajmel, Associate Professor at the Center for Engineering and Society. I think there is an echo. I hope it's fine now. Sorry for the sound. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm also Concordia University Research Chair for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion in STEM, and as Anna already mentioned, Director of the EDI Lab, and I'm thrilled that we are hosting this event today together with Fourth Space. Today we will talk about national and international strategies to implement EDI practices in allocating research funds and awards. How can we make research funding more accessible, especially for historically underrepresented groups? What strategies are funding agencies in other countries applying to make funding more equitable? Now, these were also the leading questions for a report produced by the Fonds de Recherche de Québec and by the Quebec Inter-University Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Network, which will be presented and discussed today. The title of the report is Innovative EDI Practices by Granting Agencies, and the French launch of the report already took place in November, so this is the English launch of the report. I already would like to mention that you will find all the links of the mentioned documents in the chat whenever the speakers will mention them. So maybe I should start with a quote from the report, which I find particularly important. Central to their mission, granting agencies administer and distribute research grants and awards. For the research community, this funding is often critical to the completion of research projects, as well as to career advancements and the progression of graduate and postgraduate students. I think this demonstrates that funding is not only relevant for the individual researcher or for an individual research project, but also for the future of researchers, for the future of highly qualified personal, for graduate students and undergraduate students. So everything that we are doing on behalf of EDI, which is related to research funding, has an impact, a huge impact on future of research. Now, I'm thrilled to have with me fantastic panelists who I'd like to briefly introduce, and I start with the panelists who are with me in the room. I'm starting with Bibiana Pulido, who is co-founder and executive director of RIQEDI, an inter-university network in Quebec for equity, diversity, and inclusion, which has the mission of uniting actors of Quebec universities to promote and integrate EDI values within their institutions. Hello, Bibiana, great to have you here. Next, I present the principal author of the report that we are getting presented today, Concordia Horizon postdoctoral fellow and EDI Lab member, Miriam Finn-Neuschild. Hello, Miriam. And I'm now turning to our panelists who are joining us online. We have guests from Germany, from Australia, and also from Quebec. I start with Fanny Eugène, Strategic Advisor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Quebec Research Funds. Hello, Fanny.
Hello.
And next we have Nina Steinweg, who is joining us from Germany. Good evening, Nina.
Hey. Good evening. Bonsoir.
Nina is Senior Researcher at the Center of Excellence, Women and Science, CEWS, of the Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Germany. And next we have Anna Kelso. She's not joining us live because it's in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. She's in Australia, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council. Since it's now in the morning in Australia, Dr. Kelso was not able to join us in person, but she and her team were so kind to produce a video to share with us their experiences and their approaches of their new initiatives of EDI in research funding. Thank you so much for these great contributions. Now, without further ado, let's get started, and I would like to turn to Fanny. Fanny, FRQ and EDI. Could you tell us a bit more about the FRQ, the Quebec Research Funds, and also especially FRQ strategies for equity, diversity, and inclusion?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. And for those of you who don't know the FRQ, it's actually the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, so the Quebec Research Funds. It's actually 3 different agencies that are grouped together. So I work as a strategic advisor on EDI for all 3 Quebec Research Funds, and our what we do mainly is fund post-secondary research through grants to researchers and scholarships, mainly to grad students and postdoctoral fellows. So each fund covers a different sector of research. So we have the Fonds Nature Technologie, which covers all STEM domains, and the FRQS, so Santé, which covers the health disciplines. And we have the Fonds Société Culture, which covers social sciences, humanities, education, arts, and literature. So it's a diverse set of fields. So our EDI strategy was launched in June or July 2021. It's a 5-year strategy that is based on some guiding principles. One of them being that we want EDI to go way beyond statistics. Oftentimes when we hear about EDI, people think of a targets number of people from different groups, but it's really important to us to think not only of the D in EDI, but also of inclusion and equity. So it goes beyond statistics. And we see diversity as a broad definition. So it's not only, in Quebec, we have several designated groups that are targeted by the law for equity, but we see diversity as much larger. So it's not only racialized groups, women, people living with a handicap, but the people with disabilities, but it also includes people from different socioeconomical backgrounds, first-generation students at a university. So there are several variables that are considered in our strategy. And the strategy is oriented, of course, toward who is doing the research, but also how the research is done. So we have some measures that target more inclusion, more diversity in researchers, students, trying to better understand the obstacles that some groups face and to, well, eliminate or suppress them as much as we can from their course. And we also believe it's important to consider diversity in the research. So how research is done, who are the participants of research, who gets to benefit from the research, who gets to know about the results as well. So in how the results are published afterwards or communicated, it's also important to consider diversity. And another important part of our strategy is aimed at our organization per se. So our, the employees at FRQ, so making sure that they also have an inclusive and diverse environment.
Thanks, Fanny, for introducing FRQ's EDI strategies. Now, you already mentioned EDI is relevant on all levels. Maybe the next question, I'm now just continuing with you. What made FRQ commission this report?
Well, part of our strategy, one of the objectives of our strategy is aimed at accelerating the advancement and sharing of knowledge on EDI. So we wish to base our actions on scientific literature that's related to EDI, but also on best practices. So we asked the RIQEDI to look at what was done internationally. And well, there are several reviews that have been done on practices internationally, but so we asked them to focus on what hadn't been reported in the previous or existing reviews. So to look at different agencies, different initiatives, and to find not a complete overview of all the existing practices, but to find some inspiring practices that that could help us think about what kind of measures we can put in place, but also inspire other granting agencies as well, because part of Objective 4 is to share the knowledge on EDI. Everyone working in EDI knows that we're often under-resourced. We're often one person in an agency working on this. So having all the information on EDI shared across different agencies was really important to us, which is why we had it translated as well in English.
Thanks, Fanny. So you already mentioned RIQEDI. Maybe I'm now turning to Bibiana with my next questions. Please tell us more about RIQEDI, about your network.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for organizing this, Tanya, Myriam from the EDI Lab. It's great. I'd like to thank also le Fonds de Recherche Québec, the FRQ, because without your support and your funding, we wouldn't have been able to do this amazing report. So thank you for your confidence. The Réseau interuniversitaire québécois pour l'équité et la diversité et l'inclusion is a young non-profit organization. It was created in 2018, 2019, And basically, it started off like a community of practice. So it was initiated initiated when the Canadian research chairs asked Canadian universities, to present EDI plans. And of course, that made some, how would I say? It changed the ecosystem of research, because we were officially integrating EDI in the research. So basically, at the beginning, there wasn't necessarily expertise in our universities that were working on that, and we united ourselves. I remember Fanny was there at the first meeting we had at ETS. And we were about 25, and we had different universities. We had the Commission of Human Rights, other granting agencies. And what came afterwards this meeting, it grew, the community grew, which was amazing. And the community is very large. We have professors, we have researchers, we have EDI advisors, research advisors, students. So it's interesting because we have different perspectives related to EDI, and that community grew, which became later on a nonprofit organization. So basically, we're independent of universities. We work with all universities that want people from the university that want to work and collaborate and co-construct initiatives with us. So it's basically that. If you go to the website, you'll see we try to do some accessible material. You have more information of what it is. And I like to mention that because of my role as a director of the Réseau, but I'm also director of strategy, partnerships, and training at a research institute that is based at l'Université Laval, which is called Institut Équité, Diversité, Inclusion, Intersectionalité. We have this great partnership with them, and of course they help us out with a lot of resources. So if you also go to the Institute's website, you'll see a lot of resources that are accessible to everyone. So more or less, that's what the RIQEDI is.
Thanks, Bibiana. I think that's very interesting that it's an independent organization or an independent network, which provides even more opportunities to advise universities or to have or explore new ideas of EDI. That's very, very exciting. Now, you work closely with Miriam and with Fanny on the report. Can you maybe tell us more about the methodology before we then go to Miriam with the report?
Of course. So we work closely, Fanny, Miriam, and I. But like you mentioned, Miriam is the first author. She's the main author of this report. She did mostly all the research related to that. So it's very good. And at the beginning of the process of this research, it was clear that we couldn't present everything that was done. And we had to focus on the fact that we wanted to inspire innovative practices. We didn't want to do an extensive literature review. So where we started off, we looked at 4 systemic reviews that addressed EDI and gender issues. And then which includes 246 studies in more than 30 countries, 130 initiatives in 19 countries, 53 initiatives in 28 countries, and 16 initiatives in 8 countries. So you'll see that we had a big scope of what was done globally. And what was important also is we tend to focus to give more attention, or we look more at literature that is done in the North. So behind that, it was important for us to look what was done in other countries from the South. So if you read the report, we have countries like Argentina, China, India. So you'll see there's interesting practices that come out of that. So we wanted to go beyond what we're used to seeing. Also part of that analysis of the 4 systemic reviews that were presented, we did a website exploration. So about 25 websites of different funding agencies in 23 countries presented these initiatives. And we thought that it was interesting. You could look at literature, you could look at websites, but we said it's not enough. We need to speak to people from other countries that are from granting agencies, which was great. So Miriam, she did all the connecting with different colleagues around the world, and we did some interviews, and it was so interesting because we discussed. We wanted to know more what was done. And in fact, Nina is here. We had an interview with Nina, and it was great because we saw another perspective. So we did that, and it gave us more information of other initiatives. Also, like Tanya mentioned, we also have our colleague Anne Kelso from the Australian Health Council. So because of the time at the moment, she did a great video with her team, so she'll be talking more about the initiative of the Australian Health Council. And what we saw in these 3, like the systemic reviews, the website exploration, and the interviews, is that mostly all of the initiatives were gender-based, and included less of the other groups, the other marginalized groups. Mostly all the measures limit themselves in the influence of unconscious bias in granting allocations. So for us in Canada, we see much of that. And like I talked before, there's not a lot of initiatives of the Global South that are presented, and mostly all the initiatives that we saw that are presented are more related to science and technology. So that was interesting, and so basically that's about it. So you'll see the report, we wanted to have it short and sweet, and so that everybody read it and get inspired of what's done in the world.
Thanks, Bibiana, so much. I think now we are very curious to learn more about the report. Now I'm turning to Miriam. As Bibiana already mentioned, there are a lot of key features of the report, a lot of data, a lot of interesting things. We will not present them all today. It would be too many. But maybe you can, as Bibiana already mentioned, you can share with us the perspectives of including funding agencies from the Global South. I think Bibiana already mentioned Argentina, so maybe you can talk about that.
Yes,
please.
Thank you very much. So as we were saying, we wanted it initially to fit into 20 pages with the images and all the font. It gives a 50-page report, but I had to make hard choices, and one of the choices I did was to bring in initiatives from the Global South that were inspiring and that really made me think of other concept idea that could give us idea that we can implement here in Quebec and Canada. I also wanted to mention that we extended not only to funding agencies, but also to some institute or some to research institute or committees in order to actually achieve this Global South and extending knowledge around EDI. So what I wanted to talk to you about the Global South is the Argentina initiative that's in the report, which is actually in one of the mainstream we've seen of funding agencies, which is to collect data and on applicants. It can be socio-demographic data, it can be funding, how many people get funding or not. So data on applicants and funded project is something funding agencies are doing. And they're trying to present these data in some ways. We need to be sure that when we speak about socio-demographic data, it's not the same legal frame for each country. So each country cannot present the same socio-demographic data. And many of them make them publicly available, which should be made in respect to the people involved. So I was really impressed by the CONICET initiative. CONICET stands for the Consejo Nacional Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas. Hopefully my Spanish is okay, which means the National Scientific and Technological Research Council of Argentina. What they did an amazing portal, so a web portal with data about their funding project. So it's a digital portal and includes information such as the geographic origin, the discipline, the gender, the career level, partner countries, etc. When you go on this website, you have data that is available for multiple years, so you can click on the years, and you can also have the data in form of a table or a graph. And also I noted that when you tag the gender type, it's cross-referenced with other categories such as discipline or career level. So I found it was a very nicely made portal. And so I would like to present an example of one of these graphs. So I would like to show up one slide I prepared. So thank you for putting that up. So here you have the geographic distribution of funded projects. I know it's small, but you can see the map of Argentina. You have a scale of colors, so going from, I think, 6% to 30% or so. And you see that there's a darker region in the map. In Argentina, this region is actually the capital region. And then you have different colors for the different parts of Argentina. And you see also you had it for the years, and you could also click to have it in a table form. Now, what it made me think is that this data, this geographical data is, in my knowledge, not accessible in Quebec or Canada. And we also have geographical regional disparities. So we have universities that are in urban centers, such as in Montreal, which holds 4 universities, and in the region there are other ones. And we also have regional universities, such as in Rimouski or in northern British Columbia. And so I would be interested to see how are the funded projects seen geographically? What is the density? What is the color, the strength of color through Canada? It also made me think that maybe, and I don't know, I'm sending out the idea, maybe we could have, it's a means to foster, encourage research that is made in outlying region. And so in some, the CONICET initiative, data release on geographical distribution and funded project may be aware of maybe power relations between urban centers and outlying region. And even if you take the words that I couldn't find any other words to better explain this, but when I went to Rimouski, they told me, well, telling us we're outlying region is kind of compared to what? So even the words we're using to describe the situation is actually pointing out on what's the center, what's the periphery. And so I would like to pursue the discussion maybe about these kinds of ideas.
Thank you, Miriam. I think that's a very interesting point for the discussion. Showcasing the research distribution geographically, that's very interesting. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the research. The report combines documentation, search, and interviews. 2 of the interviewees are present, Dr. Steinweg Nina and Anna, virtually via video. You also spoke to New Zealand.
Yes.
And funding agencies there. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is particularly important also for Canada, since there is a similar awareness with regards to Indigenous population. So what are their approaches?
Yes, so that's what one of my interest in having a collaboration with Australia or New Zealand, because these are 2 countries which also have a colonial history, which also have an Indigenous population and are maybe doing I was questioning myself, are they doing things differently? And actually, for the New Zealand context, it was very, very inspiring and interesting because their history is a bit different. I would like to maybe make a little summary. There was a treaty that was signed between the Maori population and the Crown in, I think it's 200 years ago. I don't have the exact date on my notes. Sorry, I'm going off script a bit. But they signed a treaty, and this treaty made things very different and made things that, for example, Maori language, te reo, is a national language. It makes also that university must address these questions differently. And actually, we met with two New Zealand organizations, but the one I would like to talk about today is the committee Te Kaui Amukura. Te Kaui Amukura is a committee made of 8 members, which holds for the 8 university in New Zealand, and it's an organization called University New Zealand Te Pokai Tara, which holds this Te Kaui Amukura committee, and it brings together people holding positions such as Deputy Vice Chancellor Maori, Assistant Vice Chancellor Maori, or Pro Vice Chancellor Maori. And so Te Kaui Amukura is really in the idea of promoting Maori interest and foster their success. It's been launched and formed in 2004, so almost 20 years ago. In 2015, they developed a strategic plan that is so good that I will cite you some excerpts, which are also in the report. And their plan is really focused around 3 key areas. So here I'm reading part of their strategic plan. So one of the first points is to improve outcome for Maori students. In their papers, they're really speaking about using the Maori language. So here, students is taora, and I will use that word in the next point I will be describing. So improving university graduation rate of Maori taora, ensuring that taora are supported to study and succeed as Maori, and boosting the number of young Maori eligible to attend university. Their primary focus is really about Maori taora or employees. The second point of their strategic plan is to improve outcome for current and future Maori university staff. So not only the taora, but also the staff, by ensuring that the performance-based research fund produce positive outcome for Maori researchers. And the third point of the strategic plan is to increase universities' role in the revitalization of te reo, which holds for the Maori language. And I worked on this report 2 years ago, almost less than a year ago, and revitalization of the language was not a discussion we had in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. And so speaking with them, speaking that they were really actively in the revitalization plan, it was really interesting. Also, Te Kaui Amukura is not fixed. They're doing amazing work, and I would encourage you to go to their website regularly because they're launching new initiatives regularly. So their last thing they did recently that I want to mention is that Te Kaui Amukura partnered up with the Committee on International Policy to develop the first pan-university sector approach to internationalization from an indigenous perspective. In other words, it's a global indigenous network, which we can also say as Ngā Hir Matauranga in te reo. So this is a numerical space for universities, researchers to collaborate, innovate, and connect. The Global Indigenous Network gives access to communities and indigenous researchers to participate in forum and have access to resource on indigenous language, revitalization, indigenous development, and indigenous education. And when we talked to them, they were really generous that we could have an hour conversation, giving all the work that they're doing. They were speaking that they had a lot of contact with Southern American indigenous communities, and that was the idea where the global indigenous idea come from, to share experience and knowledge about key points for communities, such as language revitalization, for example. So it was really inspiring speaking with them.
Thanks, Miriam, for sharing that with us. Now, language and official languages is, I think, a topic of its own in Canada. In our case, it would be Kanien'kehá:ka, who needed to be an official language in Quebec. I think there is also maybe a federal question, right? The different provinces with different languages. And I believe I know that Northwest Territories has a couple of official Indigenous languages. So maybe that's a starting point. But thank you for sharing this very exciting initiative. Now, in the report, you also describe that funding agencies are using random draw as a method to allocate funding more equitably. And you also wrote recently an article in The Conversation Canada about that. What is the international take on random draw? What are people thinking about random draw?
Yes, so the first thing I would like to say is that I've seen a switch in the interest. So there's a kind of a strong interest now, but when I started asking myself questions about that a couple of years ago, it was a funny idea. People were not very convinced about random draw. I was a strong advocate, and I say, I want to put it in the report. I really want to speak about random draw, and I really went to see if I could find any funding agency that was using it. And actually, there was the New Zealand Health Council, HRC-NZ, which is in the report, which used it. And when I asked questions, I was telling them, oh, we're so glad you're using random draw. And they were like, well, we're mainly using anonymization and then random draw. So it was kind of funny seeing how people are having an opinion on random draw, and that it comes, I understood afterwards that it comes into something bigger. How do you think about how you fund projects? And so the first thing is that I've seen two ways of using it. It's not exhaustive, it's what I've seen. So the first way, which was used by the health agency in New Zealand, was for high risk, high gain projects. So here, the committee members, the funding agency acknowledged that for these high risk, high gain projects, we don't actually know which one will succeed. You don't know, like you cannot predict the future. So what they say, okay, we'll think of a way of making that process different. And so the first step they did was to anonymize the project. So you just submit a project, and then the committee was evaluating on two criteria. The first one was, is it the potential to be transformative? And the second one is the project viability. Now they receive, I don't know, 14 projects. On these 14, there are 7 that are meeting this criteria. And they can only fund, I don't know, 4 projects. Well, then these projects are put into a bag or in a random draw generator. And so you pick on the project that has succeeded these excellency criteria. And so that's the first way of doing it that I've seen that is being implemented since a couple of years, actually, in the case of the New Zealand health funding agency, the Health Research Council. Then there's also another fund that I've seen recently, so the Austrian 1000 Idea Fund, which also use the same method for one of their program, high risk, high gain, and you see if they meet the criteria. So that's one way of doing it. And it's usually for, in the case of New Zealand, team projects. Now there's another way I've seen of doing it, and I've learned about it by speaking. So doing interview was really interesting because when I spoke to the Swedish Research Council, which is in the report also, but not today, I invite you to read the page on the Swedish Research Council. They spoke to me, oh yeah, I think I know someone in Switzerland that's doing random draw in their funding agency. So by the word of mouth, I dig up and found that yes, indeed, the Swiss National Science Foundation is using the random draw since a couple of years too. And it's they started with the postdoctoral fellow program. And here the argument is that when you have postdoctoral fellow, you have a certain number of people applying and you cannot give money to everyone. So you have a kind of a line where you differentiate between people having funding and those not being funded. And at this line, at this part, there can be discussion, political discussion, there can be unconscious bias. And so in order to remove or attenuate that, they are saying, okay, well, we can offer the possibility for committees to draw between people who are at the limit of the funding. And so that's what they did. And it happened for only 3.2% of the application that's been differentiated in this way. It was so successful that the Swiss National Science Foundation added random draw in their organizational regulation. So now in their regulation, they say that you can use random draw to differentiate applications. And I would like to cite a quote from Matthias Egger, the president of the Research Council of the Swiss National Science Foundation, which says, in cases that are too close to call, this randomized process makes selection fair for the researchers involved. And actually, they were surprised by the response for the postdoctoral fellowships people. When you receive your letter and it says your funding was good enough to be funded, but a random draw decided otherwise, they're actually taking that very well, and the Swiss National Science Foundation didn't expect that. And so random draw is now actually something that's being discussed and how can we apply it? And so we had discussion with, for example, the NSERC. They asked us a lot of questions about how can it be adapted to national context. And that's the purpose of this report, is to trigger ideas that then you say, well, this idea, how can I put it into my organization, into my national context, and how can it bring me to somewhere else EDI-wise?
That's super exciting. I think that's really a great idea. Of course, when it intersects with, let's say, gender, for example, or having more applications from men than from women, then the random draw might even benefit more the men. So there is a lot of that which has to be thought of at which level, or what is the selection before it comes to the random draw procedure, right? But I think it's very interesting what you said, that the applicants even accepted more when they were declined or when they weren't successful, so that it's more acceptable for the applicants. Probably we'll discuss more about random draw later in the question and answer period. Now, I'm now turning to Nina. Sorry, I mixed up my script. So Nina, you are ready. I would like to turn now to you and learn more about your exciting work, especially on the Center of Excellence Women in Science. What are the key projects there? Please, could you introduce us to your work there and to the center?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, not only to participate in the report, but also today at this inspiring event. I already learned a lot in the first part, and yes, the Center of Excellence Women in Science was founded 20 years ago. It was originally a project of the University of Bonn, and then was transferred to the Leibniz Institute of the Social Sciences in order to continue its work. And it's also the reason for the name. I think we're talking right now about changing the name, actually, because we think it's too limited to focus on women and not on gender and anti-discrimination, because we have a broader view are developing a broader view in the last years on equity and equality in academia. And our main focus is to sort of be the bridge between research and practice. So on the one hand, we are conducting our own research, but we also present research data and information on research. And on the other hand, we try to support gender equality officers, which are actually mandatory in German universities since the beginning of the 90s, I think, so have been for a long time. And they do a lot of important work, and so we try and provide resources and information to also make their work more connected to research. But on the other hand, we also advise ministries, or for example, we give talks on at local or regional conferences of gender equality officers. So it's a pretty wide range of tasks. And we also always are sort of in between the two main focus groups, the practitioners and people who do research on gender issues and on higher education. And some of the main projects we are currently working on is for example, the UNICEF project. My colleague Anke, she is in a consortium in an EU project working on gender-based violence in academia. And it's a very important project because there has been no data so far, especially in Germany. And so they gathered really a big data set in, I think, altogether more than 40 institutions all over Europe in all the different languages. And the data is going to be published, I think, during this year. And it's a very important step, I think, to gather information and to have more transparency about gender-based violence and discrimination in academia. So that's one of the bigger projects. And the projects I was working on for the last 3 years is the StarQ project, where I looked at research on measuring quality of gender equality measures, because that's an important political topic. Some of the funding agencies and also the ministries are getting sort of nervous because there has been a lot of funding for gender equality in the last 20, 30 years. And the numbers of professors, female professors, are rising only very, very slowly. So the question always comes up, what are these measures actually do? How do they, what kind of impact they have, and how can you measure the quality? Also aside from impact, because of course, you all know measuring impact is really difficult because there's so many factors that have an effect on why women leave academia or why they stay in academia. And so that's a big question. And we try to work on recommendations on specific topics, on mentoring, active recruitment, and gender sensitivity. So maybe I stop right there. I could talk on and on about the projects we're doing, but I just wanted to highlight 2 of them.
Wonderful, thank you. of course, we would like to know more about that, but maybe I continue to the next question, because you developed a toolbox that sounds very exciting, the INCA database. And I tried it out, and I found one of my old projects, which I initiated in 2004 at Humboldt University at this database. So I'm very happy. Please tell us more about the database.
Yes, this database was actually originally launched by the German Science Foundation, the DFG, a long time ago. So I've been working on it since 2008, which is a very long time. And the idea was at the time, the DFG asked the universities to deliver reports on their progress in gender equality. And in order to support them by developing measures, they came up with the idea of building up a database. And so it was a project we did with the DFG for until 3 years ago. And now the database was further developed within the StarQ project. And we will now host the database at GESIS in the future. But of course, it's very difficult to work on it now without having the funding, because it's not sufficient to only update some links, but you always have to look out for new ideas, new measures, and of course have to look at what do you already have in the database and then compare it to newer measures. And this is a lot of work. We only have around 350 projects or measures in the database, but they're on all different levels on fostering junior scientists, for example, but also on changing organizational culture. So they're all different levels of gender equality measures, and the initiatives by the DFG have really brought a lot of attention to gender equality measures. And so some universities count up to 250, 300 single measures they offer as far as gender equality is concerned. So you can imagine how many measures we have to look at and assess in order to pick out the good practice for the database. So that's always a big challenge to look at the changing trends and new initiatives in order to keep the database updated.
Yeah, that sounds like a big project. And the good practices, it's also a question, how is good practice defined, right? So how are you measuring if it's a good practice? Is it the outcome? Is it the impact? But everyone wants to know, well, will there be more women? Will there be more female students, right? But you cannot, it's very difficult because there are so many factors that are influencing this. So you already mentioned that. Maybe we can stay a little bit on the results of the INCA project. So last March, you launched the report titled Analysis and Guidelines for Quality Assurance of Gender Equality Measures. Maybe, do you want to expand a little bit more on that and share some highlights of the report? That would be super interesting.
Yes, this report here today, that is we're talking about today, was presented, I thought it was the same situation. I thought we only going to publish maybe 20 pages, and then altogether we came up with 125 along the way. So yeah, we try to sort of use new technologies and big data methods in order to sort of get a picture about the current developments in gender equality measures. We use the web crawl, the German academic web, that has been crawling the university web pages since 2012. And it's very interesting because this way you can sort of try and search for certain topics and find out trends also, because you have a crawling twice a year, and that way you can sort of see if a a certain term or a definition has changed over the years. And it was, for example, interesting to see that gender sensitivity is sort of rising towards gender competence, which is sort of falling back. And I think people sort of realize that competence is something that you actually never probably achieve, but it's a continuous process to do gender sensitive or gain gender sensitivity. So we have a lot of interesting findings and try to wrap it up in different events, talking with the experts in order to develop the recommendations. And that was very well received. I think it's very important to talk to different people, practitioners, researchers, also people. We talk with people who are freelancers and working on, for example, gender sensitivity, and also try to include the view of politicians and also research organizations like the DFG in those events. And I think the recommendations are really have a very big impact, because of course there's a lot of research and people know certain best practices, but we sort of brought it all together and have it in a system, presented in a systematic way. And I think it helps a lot of people, even if they have working on gender equality for a long time, to have sort of a checklist they can go through and also change the processes at their own university. So that was a really nice outcome, that we get invited a lot to talk about the project, and we got a lot of people downloading the report so far. So yeah, we're very happy with the result.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Very exciting. You mentioned that there is a new terminology, there are new terms coming up. Sometimes it's also just wrapping the thing in a new package, right? So finding a nicer word or whatever, but the problem is the same.
It's a marketing trick sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
In Germany, it's the term Vielfalt, which is sometimes translated with diversity, but it's more like, you know, like a nice bouquet of flowers with different colors, and it's very much marketing oriented, but not very anti-discrimination oriented most of the times.
But we see it everywhere, you know, especially when anti-discrimination is basically the term that we need to deal with. But also EDI has some kind of more positive notion, and therefore we are more using EDI, but we would really like to speak or need to speak about intersectional anti-discrimination, right? Maybe we can have chat about that in the question and answer period. Thank you so much, Nina, for sharing all that with us. I think now it's time to turn to Australia and to watch the video that Anna and her team prepared for us. Okay. So it's a video.
Hello, I'm Anne Kelso, CEO.
Yeah, let Anna speak. I think she will explain it.
Hello, I'm Anne Kelso, CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia, or NHMRC. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country in the Australian Capital Territory, and I pay my respects to the original custodians of this land. We're just delighted that one of our agency's most important EDI initiatives has been featured in the Quebec Research Fund publication, Innovative EDI Practices by granting agencies. Our initiative is called Structural Priority Funding, and this is where we use a dedicated part of our research funding budget each year to support additional grants below the initial funding cutoff. We use this approach to fund extra projects led by women and projects led by Australian First Nations researchers. The extra grants that we fund this way are very high quality projects that just missed out the funding cutoff. So this support helps to offset the systemic disadvantages faced by women and First Nations people in their research careers. Structural priority funding has been NHMRC's most successful EDI initiative up to this point. Since its implementation in 2017, it's helped us to achieve equal funded rates across many of our grant schemes, and in other words, projects led by women have had the same chance of success as projects led by men. However, this initiative hasn't solved a major issue, and that's the attrition of female applicants at the most senior levels of our big investigator grant scheme. The Investigator Grant Scheme offers a fellowship salary and a research support package across 5 levels of seniority, from early postdoc through to the most senior researcher, and it's a highly competitive scheme. For more than 20 years, we've seen more women than men applying for NHMRC fellowships at the early career stage, but then they disappear from the applicant pool. So even today, about 4 times more men than women apply for these grants at the most senior level. The outcome is a large disparity in the overall number of investigator grants and the total amount of money that's awarded to men versus women. So from this year, we're introducing a new initiative, a special measure under Australia's sex discrimination legislation. This decision follows extensive data analysis and consultation with the Australian health and medical research sector, as well as the Australian government, in 2022. We'll continue to use structural priority funding as needed to achieve equal funded rates for women and men at the 2 earlier stages of the scheme, where we don't see much disparity. But for the 3 most senior levels of the scheme, the so-called leadership levels, we've set a target to award equal numbers of grants across the 3 levels combined, to men on the one hand and to women and non-binary researchers on the other. Of course, all funded applications will have to be very high quality because research excellence remains the overriding criterion for funding. This is a very significant step, which we're taking because of the problem of attrition of women from the health and medical research workforce that's been so persistent over at least 2 decades. It's hardly been shifted by any of our other gender equity initiatives over more than 10 years. We know there are many reasons for this attrition that reflect our social structures. So with this measure, as for the earlier one, NHMRC is seeking to offset the systemic and structural disadvantages faced by women and non-binary researchers as they seek to build a research career. This is the first year of the new measure, and we expect to announce the first outcomes in August. We'll continue to monitor outcomes and the impact of this initiative over the years ahead, and we look forward to the day when it's no longer necessary. Our thanks go to the Quebec Research Fund for drawing attention to our EDI work at NHMRC. We've appreciated learning more about the excellent work being undertaken in Canada and around the world to achieve a truly equitable, diverse, and inclusive research enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and your team for providing this video and also for sharing a very interesting approach with us. Now, I think it's time for Q&A. Is there a question in the room or on the chat?
We'll just get this mic to you.
Hi, thanks so much for the great talk. It's been really interesting in so many different aspects of it. I was just wondering, I guess, well, Fanny's on the line and we had this conversation about random draw. I was wondering if you would comment or go so far as to comment on how to structure competitive processes in a way to make them more equitable. I mean, we're at a point this year where we're seeing the tri-agency who have increasingly had sort of undergraduate Black scholarships and providing extra quota slots for Indigenous applicants, and they sort of structure the competitions in different ways in order to improve them, presumably. But I was wondering if out of your own experiences, if we have, I guess, a best practice now emerging.
So who will take on this question? Fanny, maybe?
Yeah, I can go. Since my name was dropped in this question, so I can probably go first. Yeah, the initiatives that have been together at the federal level, for instance, the undergraduate scholarships for Black applicants at CIHR, so the Health Fund, and the SHRC, so social sciences, and some are reserved also for Black applicants at the undergrad scholarships as well. Of course, those are based on research and data that was gathered by the agencies, showing that there was an underrepresentation of Black students in their applicant pool, and that what was needed was some support at the undergrad level. Of course, and I don't want to go into the legal side of this, but it's always important if you're going to offer some funding based on one of the characteristics that is defined as discriminatory.
We don't hear you that well.
You can't hear me well?
Now
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So in the Charte des droits of the Quebec Charter for Rights, there are some motives for discrimination, and one of them being racialized group, being part of a racialized group. And all of these motives for discrimination, if you're going to action, you have to have it based on a very strong plan as to, we're asking this question so that in the future we can provide help to this group, which is why we put together our own self-identification questionnaire in 2021 at FRQ, and based on those results, we'll see how we can structure our funding programs to make sure that if we see any inequities, we can redress them or address them to correct for them. So this questionnaire has been in place for at least three more years at the federal level. So they have gathered this data. They have launched, and I don't think this was publicized that well, that much in the announcement for those scholarships, but there have been data and reports showing this need. So, and it's one approach. It's probably kind of the thing that you think most when you're thinking about structural equity, about structuring programs for more equity. But there are others, as we've seen in the report. For instance, what Anne just talked about from Australia, the structural priority funding. We're not there yet at FRQ. We haven't gathered enough data to actually determine what is needed, and of course not what's going to be done. But that's one of the reasons we wanted this this report, to have different ways of addressing inequities in our funding schemes if we find it. But we need to base this on our own Quebec Research Fund data rather than on just outside data.
Thanks, Fanny. Daniel?
Hi there, this is Dan from the Office of Research at Concordia. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm a Senior Advisor of Business Development. I actually work with Michael, who's in the room. My question is actually related to what you just mentioned, Fanny, and basically what the Australian NHMRC referenced is the fundable but not funded category. So all agencies have those. So I'm surprised to hear you say that FRQ would not necessarily have the means to access, because those are accessible. At least the fundable, not funded. The self-identified categories are different, but at least that category is available by the agencies. I wanted to know what your thoughts were, if it's a direction that FRQ and or other agencies are willing to explore.
So of course, I was talking about self-identification data. We of course gather, we analyze data to see like how many people are recommended for funding and not funded, and that's a situation that is very present in all funding agencies, I guess. We get a lot more great applications than what we can actually fund with our budget. So if I'm understanding correctly, and you can correct me, Danielle, if I misunderstood, but what you're talking about is putting in place something like a random draw, randomization after, like when we get the fundable applications, and then just randomly picking the ones that are being funded. That's what you were referring to?
I will not even attempt to dig into the internal processes of the granting agencies. What I can say, but by the suggestion, I know that, for instance, with the SHRCs, it was the 4As. So I know they removed those categories per se, but the rankings remain. Mm-hmm. So within those, in my mind, for instance, once the results are announced, and the agencies could invite those fundable but not funded categories to self-identify.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I completely misunderstood. Yeah, that's one way of that would be one
anyway,
option.
I'm just throwing it out there.
But we're more in the open to all suggestions and seeing what actually not for us as an agency, but also for the community that we serve. We looked at the publications about for instance, the randomization trials that were put in place in Switzerland, and how they were received by the community. So we do that for all the possible ways that we can address this. But yeah, so the self-identification questionnaire that we have is a very, very well protected source of information. There are 2 people in our organization at FRQ that can actually see the data where you can possibly identify someone, and the actual nominative data is only accessible to a secure group. I don't know how to say this, but who's in charge of protecting the data. So all of this has to be taken into account. But yeah, so I would say that there is no method or no way of going about resolving inequities that has been dismissed by FRQ. I wouldn't think that any has been dismissed by the federal agencies or other agencies as well. But it's a question of examining what fits and what the most pressing needs are as well, given our limited budget, like where we can actually make the most actionable measures, so we make the most progress with what we have.
I have a couple of ideas. Feel free to reach out, and I'll pick your brain.
Oh, sure, and don't hesitate to reach out to me as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fanny. Thanks, Danielle. We would also be curious about your ideas, so maybe you can share them with us. I got from this question, and also from your answer, Fanny, that it's always difficult to determine what are the groups that need to be funded, right? I mean, it's about data, it's about knowing who is underrepresented or discriminated, and that only getting this knowledge is even an important or a challenging process. and it's completely dependent on the legislation, on nations, governments, different legislations. So I would like to pick up another question, or it was rather a comment by Zena in the chat about random draw. Random draw might not ensure equity. An interesting comment. What do we think about that? Who wants to take on this question?
Well, I think I'm the random draw advocate here in the room. Well, one thing that I've seen by digging into the random draw and funding agency is that you need to think about the whole process in which it's implemented in. So the funding agencies that have developed means to use random draw are actually putting that into a certain part of the decision making and for certain reasons. And so, and it thinks also to the question we had before on the self-identification, there's no one-fit-all solutions, because every funding scheme or funding program targets different groups, which has different issues or discrimination toward this group. And I think that was something very interesting shared by Anne from the Australian Health Research Fund, was that they're looking from stages of seniority, looking what are our numbers for this stage. Oh, we see that in seniority we have, here we have a discrimination. Well, we need a program to address that. So saying random draw cannot be equitable, it's by on which funding, in which context, for which reasons. There's a lot of question that needs to be thought in the same vein of trying to implement these kind of measures. So I would say when you're in a situation where we have a committee, so a human person who has unconscious or conscious biases, who are deciding between two documents, two applications, which can be of similar quality, and deciding which one of those will be funded and which one will not be funded, I think that in that case, going for random draw ensure equity, because both of them have the same chance of being funded, which is 1 on 2. You roll a dice. So I know that random funding is something that can be seen as different, new, but I encourage people to read out what other funding agencies are doing about it, and there's Nature paper about it. So if Nature is talking about it, maybe it's getting somewhere. So I was really impressed to see that it was last autumn that 2 Nature paper was talking about random draw. So it's a discussion we're having, and it's not, I think, an idea that should be dismissed, but really think, and how can we implement it efficiently.
Thanks, Miriam. I think what's also important to consider or to keep in mind with random draw is that all these projects have already been assessed and are on the similar quality level, right? And then you can also say, well, it's also randomly which committee member is deciding on your project, right? In another committee, the other project would get funded. So I think that's a very interesting question, and we might talk more about that in future. I invite the participants online and in the room to ask more questions.
I would have two questions. I was just wondering how the Argentinians managed to address the disparities between regions after collecting their data. I don't know if there's insight on that.
Well, actually, my answer is yes and no. For the Argentina, we didn't have an interview, which would have been very interesting. I sent email and sometimes, well, people are not necessarily available, but actually I've received this morning an email saying from a member of the CONICET that I will meet in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, coming to Montreal. So I will ask the question for sure. So these ideas, I just want to say, I don't have the answer, but oops, sorry. There are processes, people are thinking, re-implementing things. So yes, it's for sure a question that I will ask in my meeting.
And I haven't read fully the report as of now, but how do other funding agencies address the the excellency of the CV of all the applicants, so as to not have a bias on that front? Because you talked about nature, so we know publications are really important for funding agencies, and so a bit how do you suggest to shift a bit the experience and value other experiences through the CV also?
So I can go if it's okay. Thank you for your question. I think the excellency question is a huge question that I'm discussing a lot with colleagues. In the case of how to make it more inclusive, one initiative that's in the report that comes to mind was the New Zealand Health Research Initiative, which went through anonymization. And so you submit a project and you don't know who's the PI, but that's on a certain kind of funding, which is not, I think, the one you were talking about, which could be student funding or PhD fundings, where you are really linked to the CV. And for that, at this moment, I don't have necessarily a clear answer. I have some idea how it can be done, but certainly there are discussion about that. And I don't know if you wanted to hop in on the excellency discussion, or Fanny maybe, I don't know. Yeah, Fanny wants to hop in.
Fanny
Go ahead.
Already, yeah.
Yeah.
We have a whole crew working on that.
Yeah, as Bibiana was saying, we have a whole crew working on excellency in research.
Yeah, so maybe I can jump in. Just before I address excellence, I'd just like to say a word about regional disparities. This is data that we have at FRQ until we've been reducing the size of our annual report for about 4 or 5 years, but it used to be published every year for the new researchers where they were based, so either in Quebec City and Montreal, or in regions outside Montreal and Quebec City. And one of the ways that we've encouraged new researchers to establish their careers outside of Montreal or Quebec is by granting a higher amount of funding for new researchers who go into universities that are outside of the big city centers in the province. So now to excellence, which is a huge question, and I'm part of this group working with Bibiana on this, and it's something that the person have been making progress on, like thinking about this. Well, we've been thinking about this, I think, since we existed. Each year we do a round of revision of our programs based on comments from the community and from reviewers on our review committees as well. But we've been pushing this a little bit more in the last few years, and some changes have been made to our evaluation criteria based on this. For instance, I think it was in 2019, one research project showed, based on data from CIHR, that when reviewers evaluated the CV of the person, women were less likely to get funded than when they reviewed the project, so showing a bias in this kind of assessment. So at FRQNT, so the fund that works on STEM research, where there's an obvious imbalance between genders, the pondération, so the value of the person criteria versus the project criteria were, so we increased the value of the project in the total score and decreased similarly the value of the CV in the score. And in the some of the research programs, so the research funding programs, we've added contributions, examples of contributions other than scientific publications, to give reviewers and candidates as well ideas of other ways that they can contribute to research, including knowledge mobilization, including in our social sciences and humanities group. So for research creation, so creation productions, different types, but we're still in a culture that highly values scientific publication. So I think it's a progressive advancement. So we're making progress. More and more our reviewers are evaluating different kinds of contributions to research, but there's still progress to be done, not only in what we put in the criteria, but how they're valued by the people that are making this assessment. But we're in the right way, I think.
Thank you, Fanny and Miriam, for answering this question, or basically discussing this question further on excellence and how to assess excellence. And I think there are a lot of grounds of discrimination which we even didn't start to discuss. For example, when it comes to proposal writing, to applications for research funding, English native speakers or not native speakers. So how is the language also impacting the chance of getting funded? Now we have ChatGPT that might be also used to write some parts of proposals. So I think there will be new questions that we always have to address. Talking about the data, maybe we can have one last question that we can discuss. Is there a question online? No, I don't see one. We talked about the importance of having data in order to be able to decide on funding, right? So how, what do you think about making data more transparent? For example, should universities publish on their websites their percentage of women, of different marginalized groups? What would you recommend from what you saw also from international perspectives?
Yeah. Nina, did you want to respond to that? Or
maybe just a brief short question. Nina, if you want, you can respond to that about the transparency of data and sharing the.
Yeah, I think maybe the German situation is a especially difficult one, because the data protection is ranked such a high value that it's very difficult to actually gather data more than just the gender on a mandatory level. So it's usually the universities do surveys, for example, with the students, and ask more than just one dimension. But it's very difficult to gather more information sort of on a mandatory level. And I think it's very difficult also because the gathering is one thing, but sometimes they don't even know what to do with the data. For example, on a level of the Bundesland, which is the regions, the 16 regions in Germany, they have to gather information on gender beyond the binary. But what they do is, because the numbers are so small, they just shift it over to the the non-binary data to the women. So they gather the data in different categories, but then they don't know what to do with it. And it's, I think, very counterproductive if you seem to actually gather data to learn more and get more transparency, but then you don't really use the data.
Thanks, Nina, for that. That's the same in Canada. We have women and gender or non-binary or gender minorities or whatever. So the big pot is basically shared now between women and non-binary. It's a really tricky thing. It's not considered a separate category for...
Yeah, and the thing in Germany is you have 4 categories by law. So you have male, female, diverse or non-binary, and no gender at all. So you have 4 legal categories, so you have to also address them, but then they sort of after they're gathered, they just all mix together. So it's legally, I think, a very difficult situation, because why would you gather information if you don't, after you gather it, you mix it all back together. So it's very annoying situation right now.
And you mix it to the women's pot and not to the men's pot. That's also the important thing, right? So it's the other than the men. Okay, so I think we are now already 1 minute left, and
Could I add on?
Yes, please.
Okay. It's a very good question, and I think the data is in some universities it's available because of the CRC plans. So if you go online and go see, because they're public, you could see the percentages of the designated groups that are represented in the universities, because CRCs ask for that. However, like we mentioned, it's tricky because it depends on the type of university. If you have a bigger university, obviously it's better because we won't be able to identify exactly who that person is. But if you have smaller universities, that's where like publishing the data is hard, because if we take the example of Indigenous peoples, well, sometimes we can't publish the percentage of that. However, we also have the Commission of Human Rights of Quebec with their program, le Programme d'accès à l'égalité à l'emploi, that also universities have to present the data. They don't necessarily put it in public, but they do have targets. And these targets need to be shared across the whole university. So we have universities, EDI advisors going through the whole, departments, faculties, and saying, look, we're here, and there are the targets that the commission is asking. So in a way, they're public. And one of the best examples we had since a few years, it's the self-ID report of the Toronto Metropolitan University that does a great job because they integrate intersectionality. So they managed to present a scope of what the university is, and it's not one of the biggest universities, and they're quite advanced, I would say, in matters of EDI. And one of the things, the last thing I always say when I accompany research teams, and that's where Fanny, we've talked about, and we don't want to know, like when teams are presenting their projects, we see a lot of demands that say, oh, well, we have 3 Asian people, we have 3 women, we have 3, Indigenous people. That we don't want to know, because people are focusing only on diversity and not aspects of inclusion. And this data is confidential. You're not supposed to know that, and legally we could go beyond that. You're not supposed to know the identification of your person. And what agencies are doing more, because they're looking at the backlash related to that, is let's take that aside. Let's look at the project. Let's look at how it could be inclusive in the team, and not only focus on that data, because it's so tricky, it's so confidential. So that's the only thing I wanted to add on.
That was very important. Thank you so much, Bibiana. Thank you all for joining us today. Miriam, Bibiana, Fanny, and Nina, and also Anna in Australia, and the participants here and online. I was happy. This was a great discussion and a great presentation. Thank you all. And we'll keep you posted whenever is something new about EDI. Thank you so much. And thanks Fourth Space for hosting us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. This was a wonderful early afternoon event. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us in person and on the Zoom. We're going to close the Zoom up now. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.